interest of time, we are going to get started here. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this webinar on this Thursday afternoon. If you are new or if you don't know where you are tuning into the federal grant webinar series, and this is our first webinar, and I'll get into that a little bit here. My name's Ann Mysak. I am the project manager for the Colorado Farm and Food System Response Team. I'm a food systems and grant writer consultant contracted with them. So yeah, really nice to be here, work with all of you. The Colorado Farm and Food System Response Team came together last year to respond to the COVID pandemic and the challenges that many farmers and ranchers were facing in our state, particularly small and mid-sized producers, BIPOC, LGBTQ+, women, beginning farmers and ranchers, veterans and disabled farmers. So we wanted to make sure that they were getting resources and making connections and able to pivot just like all of the larger farmers who, more traditionally get support. So this is a continuation of that work. We want to make sure that all of you have access to resources, including USDA grants, which is obviously a huge source of funding. If you can go to the next slide. Thanks. So the partners putting on this webinar are the Colorado Farm and Food System Response Team, Nourish Colorado, the Colorado Food Systems Advisory Council, and the food systems team at Colorado State University. Next slide. And like I said, this is a webinar series about the federal grant process. So you are in framing and developing federal food system grants. If you didn't mean to be here, now's your chance to duck out. We're going to be spending the next hour together learning about the ins and outs of what does it take to apply for their grant and how to be successful in that process. And then we also hope you will join us for the subsequent two webinars in this series, the stories of past federal food system grant applicants, where we'll hear real stories and experiences from 4 different applicants, 2 as organizations and 2 farmer applicants. So we'll hear them talk about why they were successful and everything that they did or wish they had done differently. That is next Thursday, April 15th at 1 o'clock Mountain Time. And I believe Wendy just put the link in the chat if you want to sign up for that one. And then our final webinar in the series will be how to improve Colorado and the federal grant processes. So that one is really going to be more of a discussion. It's actually a 90-minute webinar. That one will be Wednesday, April 28th at 3 p.m. You can also register for that one. Wendy just put that chat in a link in the chat. And that one will really be a chance for us to talk as a community about what works, what doesn't work, what's accessible, what isn't accessible, how and what improvements we'd like to see both in state and federal grant processes. So with that, I believe I'm going to turn it over to our esteemed colleagues, Dawn and Becca with CSU, and I will let them introduce themselves and get into the meat of this presentation.
Well, thanks so much, Ann. So Dawn and I are very excited to be with all of you today because in addition to being professors at Colorado State University and part of our food systems extension team, we do a lot of work with many of the different U.S. Department of Agriculture agencies. We have been on a lot of review panels. We spend probably more time than we wish we did writing grants, but we also try to do a lot of work in supporting all of you throughout the state and making sure that we capture more of this money and bring it to support all of the great work that you're doing in the state. So we're very excited to participate in this webinar today to try to make sure that more of those funds come to support all of our ongoing efforts. And we know that it is not easy sometimes to navigate the process and then figure out where is the right grant for you. And particularly this year, there's a lot of additional resources that have actually been made available because of the pandemic. And so it's a really good year to apply for these funds. And so we really are trying to encourage as many of you who have ag and food businesses, who are nonprofits, who are working in the food system sector to go after these. So we're going to do three things today. First, I'm going to present a highlight of some of these grant programs. There is no way we could touch on all of the grant programs, so we're going to touch on those that we think are sort of the low-hanging fruit opportunities based on the work that we know is happening in the state. Second, Dawn is going to talk about principles of framing a fundable project, and she's going to have to do that fairly quickly, unfortunately, but there's going to be opportunities, I think, to follow up with us should you have additional questions. And then we're going to open it up to questions and discussion, and there we hope you can ask us things that are a little bit broader, right? If you have specific questions about your project, we could do that offline. So as I mentioned, there are a huge number of grants that are available to support food system efforts throughout the country. So this is a list of some of the programs that USDA puts together. This is also available on our website, and Dawn put the link to the website in the chat box. So there is no way that we have time to go over all of these today. So as I mentioned, we're gonna hit on a few of the highlights. And I just wanted to also start by saying that because of the COVID relief bill, there's extra support for some of the specific programs that we're going to discuss today. So the Value Added Producer Grant Program, as well as the programs under what they call LAMP, which is the Local Agriculture Market Program. So this includes the Farmers Market Promotion Program, the Local Food Promotion Program, and the Regional Food Partnership Program. All of those have additional funds available. And because of these additional funds, there are also changes in terms of matching requirements. So as I said, it's a good year. The program that we're going to talk about today that does not have additional funds available is the Community Food Projects through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, but that is still there and a great program to apply for. So let's start by talking about the Farmers Market Promotion Program and the Local Food Promotion Program. I noticed as people were coming in that I think several of you have actually applied for and been successful with this program. So these are both programs through the Ag Marketing Service, and they're very similar. So I wanted to put them on the same slide so we could talk about and highlight the differences. The Farmers Market Promotion Program is really focused on direct-to-consumer activities. And just to make sure that's clear, these are activities where a farmer or rancher is selling directly to the end customer at a farmer's market, through a CSA, through a roadside stand, freezer beef, anything like that. The Local Food Promotion Program is targeted for intermediated supply chain activities. So this is if you are a food hub, if you're selling farm to school, if you're selling through a restaurant, right? You're not selling directly to the end consumer. And so those are the major differences. Within the Farmers Market Promotion Program, there's two subtypes of grants. One is a capacity building grant, and the other is a community development training and technical assistance grant. So the bar is lower for the capacity building grant, right? Because that's really around planning activities. Whereas if you go after the community development training and technical assistance, you're going to need to show that you have some traction, right? You've been doing this work. You have a very clear idea of what you want to do and how you're going to get there. And so if you have questions about which phase you think you're in, we're happy to chat with you about that. But those are kind of the two major differences. And you're going to see that that's a theme reflected in a lot of the grants that we'll talk about today. The Farmers Market Promotion Program grant does not have a matching requirement, and the grants range from $50,000 to $500,000 with a lot less funding available through the capacity building compared to the community development training and technical assistance. The Local Food Promotion Program is really focused on that the applicants must aggregate, distribute, process, or store those products. Local has a definition within a 400-mile radius or within the same state. Again, there's two subtypes, planning and implementation. And this grant does require a 25% match. There may be changes on that 25% match. Unfortunately, for both of these grants, we had timed this webinar because we thought that this RFA would be out by now. It is not out yet. So the guess is that there actually may not be a matching requirement this year, but at least as of last year, there was a 25% matching requirement. And you can see that the levels of funding are between $25,000 and $500,000. The USDA Ag Marketing Service grants are, I think, fairly straightforward to write. I think they're easier. They have a nice template. So they're a little bit easier to write than grants that are available through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, for example, or through rural development. I think they're more straightforward. And one of the nice things that Ag Marketing Service does is they provide you this decision tree to try to figure out which grant is right for you. And so I encourage you to go take a look, and you can see that the link is below here. So as I mentioned, these programs are both administered by the Ag Marketing Services, and the applications have not yet opened for 2021. I know we had some questions about the entities that are eligible to apply. The key thing here is that an individual producer is not eligible for this grant. This is really meant for either networks or associations of producers or food policy councils, economic development corporations, nonprofits, right? So it's really more of a group that's going to do this work than an individual farmer. But that being said, demonstrating that farmers are directly involved and beneficiaries of these grants is going to be very important. You'll hear later, Dawn's going to talk a little bit about the role of letters of support or actually letters of collaboration. And I think for both of these grants, you really want to show those. So really quickly, I know we're going to spend time next week in the next webinar where you're actually going to hear from folks who've gotten these, but I thought I'd provide a quick example for each of them. I wrote a grant a few years ago on behalf of the Northern Colorado Food Cluster for a local food promotion program for a farmers market promotion program grant that was successful. And so the idea behind this grant was that we have a lot of farmers markets in Northern Colorado. So this was when I wrote this grant, which was probably 3 or 4 years ago, maybe even 5 years ago now. These were where the farmers markets were, but we really didn't have coordination across the farmers markets. And we heard a lot from producers in the region that these farmers markets weren't as successful in the sense that they didn't draw as many customers and that farmers who sold at these markets weren't making as much money as they potentially could. And so what this grant really was intended to do was to find opportunities to actually bring these market managers together and develop a plan to think about how to strengthen direct-to-consumer markets. And I apologize that it says LFPP when this is really a farmers market promotion program grant, but you can see here that it's really focused on farmers markets and direct markets here, and with the end result of trying to have a better relationship across the farmers markets, which are going to result in improved profitability for participating farmers and ranchers. Another program that is under this regional food partnership, so that LAMP umbrella, this is the new program. This is the newest of the programs. Last year was the first year that it awarded funding, and it was established as part of the 2018 Farm Bill. So this is again through an ag marketing service. And the goal of this program is really to support partnerships that connect public and private resources. So if you were going to go after a regional food partnership grant, you have to be able to demonstrate very strong partnerships across the food system. So unlike the local food promotion program or farmers market promotion program, where you could be working in a specific aspect of the food system, this is really across the food system, right? It's trying to strengthen viability and resilience of that ecosystem. And so you have to be able to show that breadth of partnerships and diversity of stakeholders, again, from the public and private sector. Unfortunately, applications have not yet opened for 2021, but we do have a little bit of information about what they funded in the first round last year. So there were 23 of these partnership grants that were awarded in 15 states. We actually were able to secure one of them in Colorado. So it was a Valley Food Partnership that took the lead on this, that was able to secure a planning grant. And you can actually go onto their website. I think I put the link. If I didn't, I'll stick it in the chat in a few minutes here. And they've got a really nice website now to talk about what's happening out on the West Slope. I think what's really interesting about this project and a great example to look at and to think about if you're moving forward is look at all of the areas that they are covering under this grant, right? They're thinking about logistics and processing, production, market channels, legitimacy, the economy, right? So you can really see here when they talk about regional food partnerships that it's this breadth of effort. And so I encourage you to go and take a look at that example. I think it's a really good one. Community food projects. So this is the one grant we wanted to mention that is through the National Institute of Food and Agriculture. My experience with this grant is that it may be a little bit more challenging, as I was saying, to write relative to the Ag Marketing Service grants. It also has more of a focus on food security than the other applications do, although the other applications, I think, talking about food security and what you're doing to address it can only help to strengthen it. But that is really the part of the main goal of this program. So it's really trying to think across the food system about how to improve food security. This grant is currently open. Applications are due May 4th. And again, like some of the other grants that I mentioned, it has both a planning component as well as this community food projects is what they call it component. So the planning grant, again, has a much lower bar, but it's capped at $35,000 as opposed to if you can go after the full blown effort, you can get $400,000. However, one of the things to keep in mind in terms of a strategy is that if you aren't ready yet for that community food projects application, going after the planning grant, getting yourself set up, you can really then use those funds to essentially build that application so that with that next round of funds, you can go after the full-blown $400,000. So in this application, preferences are given to linkages that are developed across 2 or more sectors of the food system. So they really are not looking for a project, for example, that would be focused purely on a food bank, right? It's an opportunity for the food bank to partner with a food hub that's going to partner with a producer organization, as an example. And it really wants to support development of entrepreneurial projects. And again, to develop those connections across for-profit and nonprofit food sectors. I think with this one, you also want to show that there's going to be long-term sustainability. So unlike other types of programs, for example, Nourish Colorado has been very successful with the GusNIP program, which we're not going to talk today, that's focused on nutrition incentives. Well, those are sort of one-time installments of funds. You don't necessarily have to think as much about the long-term sustainability of that kind of effort. Whereas for this program, you really want to think about, once these grants are done, how are you going to have contributed to a project that can really think about the long-term food security or improved food security of that particular place, right? So that you've developed new resources that are going to make improvements into the future. And Dawn, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about this, but there's going to be, but with these NIFA grants, you really want to think about administration as well, because there really can be a pretty large administrative burden in doing these. So one of the things that that Nourish Colorado was successful in doing in working on one of these Colorado food projects, the community food projects, was that they were able to actually develop, and I think Wendy could probably talk a lot more about this, support for this Double Up Food Buck Colorado network. I think the long-term sustainability piece of this is really helping to work with advocates. So that instead of it just being, I think, Nourish going out, they now had this sort of train the trainer model where there are others in communities that could actually be within the community to help and promote this work long-term. And the last grant that we wanted to just mention here is the Value Added Producer Grant Program. So this is administered by the USDA Rural Development, even though it is part of that LAMP program portfolio. This is targeted to producers or to producer groups. And the idea is that it's going to bear some of the risk of innovation. So that it's going to basically help to support the idea of and the development of new types of products to help you expand new markets, with the end goal of increasing producer profitability. And there are additional points awarded to Anne's initial point, right, of trying to target the entire food system. You can have actually additional points awarded if you're a small or mid-scale producer, if you're dealing with mid-tier value chains like a food hub, or if you're a beginning farmer or veteran producer. And so those are all things to keep in mind. This year, there is a huge amount of funding available for this program. There's actually $76 million available. But the way that it's going to be working, which is a little bit different, so I just want to explain this carefully. The first $35 million, which is the money that came as part of the COVID relief package, is going to be awarded first. So all of the applications are going to be scored, and it's based on a point system, and they're very transparent about what that point system is. If you received over 50 points and you were not awarded part of that $35 million, you will have an opportunity to go back and revise your proposal, because in that first $35 million, you're only going to need to document a 10% match, and all of it can be in kind. However, for the remaining 41 million, it's going to go back to the normal non-COVID rules, and it's going to require a match, and not all of it can be in kind. But you'll have that opportunity a month to go back and make those revisions if you had a score of over 50 points. And I'm happy to chat more about this if there are questions. Again, there's two versions of this grant. There's a planning grant that's up to $75,000, and there's a working capital grant that's up to $250,000, which is pretty significant if you think about that as an individual producer. What is very strict about this program is that if you're applying for working capital, you have to have a feasibility study that is completed by a third-party consultant. And at least based on my conversations, you should expect to pay a minimum of $5,000 to get that feasibility study completed. I have not found anybody who's willing to do it for under $5,000. If you know of somebody who's willing to do it, let us know, because it would be great to have that person's information. And there's very strict rules about what that feasibility study looks like. So that's really important to keep in mind. This application is open right now. It's due May 4th. And so if you are planning to apply for that working capital, you need to be on the phone like immediately after this to get somebody to do that feasibility study if you don't have it already. Or you can use that planning grant to go after and get a consultant to do the feasibility study for you, so that then you can go after the working capital grant. So as I mentioned, it's really producers that are eligible to apply for this, but also producer groups and cooperatives. Just because this is a question we get a lot about what you can use money for. So for the working capital expenses, you can't actually buy equipment, right? So you need to think a little bit more creatively about how you're going to use those funds. You can cover things like processing costs if you're going to test out development of a new product, marketing and advertising expenses, and there's some inventory and salary expenses, not your own salary, but salary for staff that you have. So keep that in mind. There's also a few resources that are available for you. The National Sustainable Ag Coalition puts out this really nice guide for applying for the Value Added Producer Grant. You can go to sustainableagriculture.net and find that. Also, we have two different resources, Value Added Producer Grant resources through USDA Rural Development, and you can email them and ask them questions. I have found that if you actually read through the application, it's very confusing about exactly what's an allowable expense. So sending them your budget ahead of time to make sure it's okay. You will be disqualified if your budget includes items that cannot be included. So running it by them ahead of time is recommended. And just as a quick example, and you're going to hear from Katie Slota from Native Hill Farm, they were able to get a value-added producer grant to help develop a new farm stand. They couldn't actually use the funds to build the farm stand, but they could use the funds to support the marketing around it. So you can see they've got these beautiful new bags that they were able to pay for, and to help, they put up billboards and other things like that. And so it's helped them to really, I think, have some professionalism as they were expanding their operation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dawn.
Thanks, Becca. Everyone take a big deep breath. I know we're going through a lot of material really fast, and then the chat box is going nonstop too. We just want to make sure we had highlights of everything. But again, we're giving you links and resources to take what we do have time to share today and have it be most effectively used. So keep bringing the questions on. So now we're going to turn a little bit to thinking about how to write a grant. And this is not everybody's cup of tea, but we do know that there's some things we can give you as hints that either would help you feel like you can do it yourself, or if you were going to partner with someone or hire someone, some guidance that you could share with them to make sure you're getting the most for your money. So the first we really want you to think about, and Becca did this throughout the discussions of those programs, is what is a fundable project? We want to make sure you guys are only spending the time writing a grant if you have a good chance of aligning with what the USDA currently sees as a fundable project. So first of all, is the idea important? Well, there's a lot of ways you could imagine talking about importance, but I think what you really want to think about is any evidence that your community, like perhaps your Chamber of Commerce or your Economic Development Community or your local Food Policy Council or Colorado's Food Policy Council has identified a priority. So we have a blueprint for food and agriculture that Becca can drop in. And if this state has said it's a priority, so one that's kept coming up in the chat box already is that we need more meat processing infrastructure. Look for any evidence you can show to the USDA that someone in your community, region, state has already said this is a much needed thing for our state's food system. And gather as much background information as you can, because you're stepping outside of your shoes and you're thinking about how do I make other people convinced that this is an important project. Also, as she said, do you have a business plan to back it up? That's really not about if it's an important project. That's about what stage of the grant you should be getting funded at. So she talked a lot about going for working capital or operational grants if you have a business plan. If you do think you're going to go in for those first stage planning grants or phase 1 grants, there it's not as important to have a business plan, but at bare minimum what you should have is some circle or network of people, some combination of producers, buyers, community organizations who will write letters for you and say, we have had this conversation in our community. This is something we've identified as an opportunity. this is worth looking into planning for. And I'm sure the Valley Food Partnership can talk to you about exactly how they built that value proposition for the grant they secured last year. And then finally, think about if you on the call are the right person to actually run the grant, or if you're more likely really should be a collaborator or a partner for someone else who might have the capacity and wherewithal to lead a grant. If you're already running a full-time business, trying to also do this might be hard. So look for partners who can do some of the things that you can't do and vice versa. So is it a fundable project? Is it important? Has someone outside of your business or organization identified it as important? And have you put the right team of people together to apply for that grant and provide letters of support? Next. These are all before you even decide on which grant and start writing. And so that networking part is the really important first step. And even though it feels like you should have a lot on paper before you approach people, really just having a one-page outline of what you're thinking you're going to do might be best, because it takes a long time to get those return emails, phone calls, and meetings put together to make sure you get everybody on board. And anything you can do as just even an outline of your ideas so that you can give people the insights that they need to decide if they do want to be on your team is important. And we would also emphasize that particularly this year, always, but particularly this year, the focus that the USDA is putting on diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice would make you rethink your teams and think hard about not just the easy people to call, because you always see them at meetings and you know who they are, but looking in some of the other corners of your community where there are people who have not been invited to the table. Any efforts you make in that even you could put in a planning grant of spending time and energy to get that circle enlarged to have a wider, more inclusive set of people, that will be appreciated by USDA this year. Next slide. So before you again approach the funder and think about writing the grant, think about if you as a producer, again, if it's a value-added producer grant, you need to be at the lead of that. You may hire someone to help you, but you need to be the lead entity. For all of those other programs, even if you're a producer who would benefit from them, think hard about if it's you that should be leading that project, or if you look to one of those community organizations or networks that you're in that can lead and you're simply going to be a collaborator. And so sometimes you have to think really creatively when you think about that. Next slide. So for example, this person who's looking for developing new markets, they might be the person to write the grant, but they might just as well look at around them at things going on. So down in Pueblo, there's an amazing Pueblo food project emerging, which would be a really appropriate partner. Feeding Colorado has now stepped into this. They want a supply of product, and they're very creatively thinking about how they can integrate producers into some of their goals for getting more fresh and slightly value-added products in through their system. Or the Colorado Grain Chain, which is another great Southern Colorado network that's come together looking for new uses for grains outside of commodity market chains. So think about if you are really the person to be applying, or if you want to link into some of these other projects that have a bigger network already established and want to look for where you can support and promote and be a partner with them going after these same monies. Next slide. Another place that you can look for ideas that have been identified by the USDA and its partners of important problems right now is me and Becca have had the luck to be on this local foods response to COVID project grant. And again, we can put that link in the box, where about 16 communities of practice in local and regional food systems from across the country have posted innovation briefs of things going on around the country. Well, the great thing about local foods is it's not as competitive. So if you find there's a really good idea someone did in Michigan, but it's not happening in Colorado, it's not really stealing to take that idea because they're focused on Michigan. They're not trying to franchise over into Colorado. So go look at some of these innovation briefs and see if there's things around the country going on in other parts of the country that aren't happening in Colorado yet. But the USDA posting this is telling you that that's something they see as an innovation and that they would find very fundable if you found the way to put the Colorado spin on those. And there's lots of good examples up in those innovation briefs. Again, these are all the ways to build your case for why your project should be fundable in the eyes of USDA. Next slide. Timing matters a lot. And even though we're now really lucky the call for proposals isn't out, usually you have about 6 to 8 weeks to put a grant proposal together. But what we would tell you is you almost have to think of it as a chess game where you back out what you want your last step to be, which is submitting that grant and all the things you have to do as steps before that. So you look at the grant deadline and think, What should I be doing 2 weeks before? What should I be doing 4 weeks before? What should I be doing 6 weeks before? And so that timeline is important. And specifically, that's why you want to get those partners and networks you might work with meeting the first week the RFA comes out. Because by the time you've accumulated all of their letters of support, all agreed on who gets what share of the budget, think about how you have goals that align with all of your missions. That takes a few meetings, and that takes a week between each of those meetings. So your first step might literally be to put that team together, look at the total budget you have to apply for, and even start divvying it up. Who's going to do the work and who gets what, because you might have to iterate on that a little bit. So think about how you get started in that budget process, particularly. Next slide, and we'll talk about the budget here a little bit more in a bit. So this is a project timeline. So 2 things for timing matter: the timeline to put the grant together, but then when you actually write the grant, you're also going to have to make a timeline with those same project partners of things you plan to do with that grant, and at what point in time. Usually you're going to be applying for somewhere between 1 year, if it's a planning grant, up to, I think the longest project I've seen is 5 years. So you'd want to think about, in addition to this, the goals you're going to make with those other organizations in your network, about, you know, and we're all in a very seasonal nature here in Colorado, what production and market season those activities are going to occur. Next slide. Again, Becca already talked a little bit about finding the best fit for the grant program for your projects, but there's also a lot you can learn looking at previously funded projects, and she overviewed some great ones for Colorado. But what's great is the USDA puts up all past projects that have been funded by any state. So if you're really wondering, I wonder if this project would work, go look through those links. And if you've seen it get funded in some other state or region of the country and not here yet, that is a very strong indication that USDA has decided that's a high priority type of project to do. And it's probably the best way, even more than anything me and Becca can explain, to give you the best information about the fit for your project. Next slide. I'm trying to go through these fast so we have some time for questions. So even though Becca already overviewed this slide, we put it back in again. So now that you have a little more context about what we're talking about, realize in this schematic, we're mostly talking today about those types of projects that are at the far right of this schematic. Those that worry about post-farm gate, value-added activities, distribution activities, consumer-based marketing activities, and that's where we have the most expertise. It doesn't mean some of your other ideas don't have merit and shouldn't be funded, and you can see there's a wide array. It's that for the ones that are going to be coming out this spring, that we at CSU from our food systems team can provide the most support on, and that we've gotten indications from the USDA will have the most increase in dollars being invested in happening in the next 6 months. So that's why we prioritized it. But we do want you to know, if you're not hearing about a topic that's a good fit for you, go back and revisit this schematic and see what other program there is, and we'll do our best to get you information on that program. Next slide. So now let's talk about writing the proposal. The first thing sounds so silly. It sounds like something we should teach in kindergarten, but read the directions. And so often people think they have to be really, really great, eloquent writers. Really what grant reviewers want is straightforward, simplistic writing that's not flowery. It hits the highlights of, this is what we asked you to tell us about it succinctly. You want to be specific, concise, and answer every question. So if it tells you it's giving points for these 5 criteria, you want to have at least a page of material about each of those criteria. So, you know, what I said is, your first thing, even though you might refine it, is to write an executive summary. Get on a 1-pager, approximately what you want to do and maybe the 2 to 5 goals you're going to do with that project, because that's how you'll go about recruiting the partners you need and getting the letters you need. You'll probably go back and revisit that once the grant's written and make it more reflective of what you exactly did, but it's the first thing you should write. Then almost every grant's going to want you to give that, again, statement of need or project justification. That gets back to the importance of your problem, whether it's some report your city put out, the state put out, the USDA put out, saying the need for more infrastructure, better connectivity, more healthful food in schools. You want to look for third-party reports and evidence that you can summarize quickly by why your project is needed in your place. Then you'll do the obvious things and we'll talk about these goals, objectives, and activities. The budget's very important. And so let's go over some of these things. The last thing I would say though is, again, those letters of support and in-kind partnerships, those are something you should start establishing the day you decide you're going to write a grant, because some of the stuff you can write in one night if you want to pull an all-nighter. Developing the partnerships take the longest time because you don't want anyone to feel like they were rushed into making a decision. Next slide. So oops, the other direction. There we go. So that executive summary again is a brief background of your organization and your problem. 2 to 5 goals is what we generally recommend for people. And then somewhere where you talk about anticipated benefits. Except for the value-added producer grants, those benefits should be more than your organization or business's wins. They should be something about the community, something about the broader food system and in supply chain, something about the eaters that you're serving. Those benefits should be bigger than the circle of your organization. Again, you want to be specific and concise, use short sentences, not flowery writing. And the thing we see that's most commonly problematic for grants is overstatements. It is not your job to fix the food system. You are too small of a cog in the food system. You want to look at the small universe you can put a circle around, and your business, your organization, or your community can make a difference for 100 eaters, 25 farmers. Think about the relevant, realistic circle you can change, and that's all you have to do with your grant. Next slide. Next is that statement of need and justification, and we've gone over this a few times, so I'll be quick, but this is, again, any evidence you can find where an outside organization has prioritized a problem you are in a good position to solve. Your community has made a set of priorities that your project aligns with. Those USDA innovation briefs point out this is something very cool going on in Illinois that you say, well, let's do that in Colorado too. So part of it is the proving someone else that it was important, and part of it is the so what of who is going to benefit that we talked about before. If you can address both of those things, you have a pretty good statement of need or justification statement. And again, be specific, be concise, and don't overpromise. You are not probably going to change the world, but I'm not trying to squash your dreams. I'm just saying the grantors don't need you to make that big of a promise. Next slide. So the next thing you have to talk about in the project summary is thinking about where you're going to highlight what you really do. So this is a recent SARE grant that was written, and even though it's long and it needs to be, I highlighted some places where there's specific pieces I just told you to do. They found studies that document a consumer willingness to pay for sustainable food products. The second bar of yellow highlighted materials, the specific activities they're going to do, and I think they have 5 here. Again, that should be somewhere usually between 2 or 5. And then the third thing I highlighted is the set of people who are going to participate in that activity and benefit from it. Those are the 3 big things as I scan a review that I look for in a project summary. And if in the first page they aren't telling me that succinctly, I know we're in for a rough ride. So always think about that and this is a 1-pager. So having lots of people read that is much easier than saying, can you read my 15-page grant? Have that 1-pager that's a really good summary of your work. Next slide. And your project description, then that will be kind of right after you've defended that you have a really fundable project, it's an important topic, and that there are people who will benefit from it. Then you need to get down to the nitty-gritty of what we're going to do. So again, you want a couple big overarching goals, whether they're about food security, improving the profitability of your farm, making better linkages in your community's food system. Have 1 or 2 of those big umbrella goals, and then start breaking them into bite-sized chunks. Then we usually call those objectives. Like, so okay, to do improve food security, there's these 3 activities that we're going to do, and those objectives end up being a little more important for your management plan, your timeline, and your budget, because those bite-sized chunks usually are where it feels enough like a to-do list that you can actually start assigning it to people, assigning it to a timeline, and think about how much money you need to do that. So for instance, a workshop would be a very bite-sized chunk of objective. And so objectives and activities might go hand in hand. Some of your objectives might not be an actual event you put on, but objectives and activities sometimes get used interchangeably too. And if you think better in activity space, that's fine as well. But this is where you'll want to see everything you list here in your objectives show up again in your budget and your timeline. Next slide. So there's some of these that you should see a pattern. So we gave this worksheet for them to share with you all, knowing it might overwhelm you a bit, but it's really, if you got this filled out for your project or your organization, and you then write up each one of these boxes as a paragraph, you have your grant written. So even though it might look overwhelming, it's a way for you to structure your ideas and thoughts and put them together. And so we wanted to provide it as a opportunity. For the background statement, that there could just be one for your whole project. It's really when you get to goals, resources, and to the right of that, where you really need to break it out into bite-sized chunks where someone could really get their head around the set of activities or to-do list that you have with that project. Next slide. So for example, going back to that SARE project that we just showed you a project summary on and highlighted some of their key activities, this is how they laid out those objectives, and they kind of put what's going to happen, who they expect to attend or participate, what timeline they expect to happen, and then a couple of things they expect to be on the agenda for that day. So you look at that in the MEET conference, the MEET school, and then, but you also could have something that's an objective that's not an event, like a decision tool, or perhaps a new promotional campaign, where it also, that goal doesn't have to be an activity or an event. It could be something that you feel like needs to be built to make your project more sustainable, or a website might be a good example. Next slide. But that's how clearly you want to lay out those activities. Then for each one of those activities, you could imagine making a corresponding spreadsheet that you would budget for each of those activities, what kind of line items you need to fund that activity getting done. Again, be realistic. They've raised the levels of these grants because they don't want you to do things on the cheap because there's not enough money to do it. So don't be bashful about asking and needing to pay, $50 an hour to get a good person to do an event plan, be an event planner for you, but be realistic about it and have it tied very specifically to an activity in your scope of work. Things people commonly forget about, but reviewers even look for these things just to make sure we see that people are thinking through the whole process systematically. I have a typo there, sorry, but travel mileage and cost to present at conferences. In addition to the conferences you might hold in your project, if you have a successful project, people are going to want you to come and share your story with them. And the government is happy to support you doing that because they want networks in this food system circles to be stronger. If you are going to have producers, mentors, advisors from your community helping with your project, don't be shy about offering them some money for their time. They don't want those to be extravagant. You shouldn't be offering people, $52,000 for coming to 2 meetings. But if you think about people being worth $25 to $50 an hour, maybe $100 an hour, you can put in stipends. And actually the reviewers really like to see that shows you have respect for the community who's supporting your project. If you're going to do dissemination, increasingly that's more social media and websites, but have a budget in there for how you are going to disseminate. And again, reviewers will look for if that's missing because it means you haven't thought that through. And increasingly, we see people hiring support for database management, translation services. If you do have an inclusive, multicultural dimension to your project, don't be shy about asking for those. The reviewers won't not only not knock it for being expensive, they'll think that means you've systematically thought through about how to make your team the strongest it can be. Next slide. So again, we gave you a worksheet here that again, once you have filled out the other worksheet that we showed you with the set of activities you're going to do, you transfer those activities over to this budget sheet and think about how you would cost out each of those budget line items. And a spreadsheet as simple as this is something you put in with your proposal. There's a place you'll have to summarize it. There's a very specific form, but the reviewers again will rarely look at that form. They'll want to see something like this that's very easily tractable. Okay, they say they're going to do this. Have they thought about the expenses of when that's going to happen? So this is how you start putting together that plan of action. Next slide. And remember, where you put money tells the reviewer something. When I open up a review and 82% of it is going to one highly paid consultant because they have a good idea, it almost immediately tells me it's not going to be fundable unless there's just an extraordinary idea there. What people are looking for in these grant proposals is well-rounded teams, all sharing resources, all sharing responsibility, all treating each other fairly to do something to move along the enterprise or the community organization that's trying to do an important project. So reviewers look for that as an indication of how seriously all of that networking and team building you talked about at the front end of your grant is actually operationalizing. I don't want to get into the details of this today, but indirect cost are something that's pretty foreign to a lot of people. And us in academia have gotten used to them for a long time. These grants have varying philosophies about them, but indirect cost is just basically something to think about all of that administrative burden Becca mentioned before. If you as an organization don't have the ability to handle some of that back office work, we call it, we at the university have a sponsored programs office and they just take care of it, but they get a share of our grant. Similarly, if you don't feel like you can handle a grant but have a really good idea, if you find a partner like a nonprofit in your community, you can offer them indirectly some percentage of your grant. That's the equivalent to an indirect cost for them being the financial steward of that grant. And so I don't want to go any further than that, but that's a good question we can take offline. But that's something important for you to understand before you shut the door that you can't do a grant by yourself, that there might be partners you can work with, but that then there will be some cost to that partner because they're managing some work you don't have to do. So I at least wanted to mention it because it'll probably be in the language of the grants. Next slide. We're getting close to the end. So for the rest of the application, those letters of support are really important. We usually see them in two forms. The actual partners, anybody not directly applying that you've mentioned in your scope of work, you should have a letter, particularly if they're offering in-kind or cost share. But if they're an important part of your scope of work, they're going to want to see a letter seeing that that organization actually did commit to actually doing those activities. That's one set of letters. The other set is from people who just, even though they're not actively in the grant, are those community members or state partners who documented the problem you're looking at as important and you're the right team to do it. So they're two very different things. You should have a little bit of both, but don't overkill. You don't need tons of them. You just need a nice solid set. But every partner who is a major player in the scope of work should have a letter committing to that. In-kind is something those partners sometimes can offer by offering some of their labor for free. But again, if you're going to count on that, it has to be documented in a letter, and the grant will lay that out fairly clearly. The last thing we want to show you is a management plan. Next slide. And this is where you have a very clear set of partners that are listed. Again, there would probably be a letter from each one of these. Hit return again. And then for each one of those partners, as you laid out those activities we talked about before, they would want to look for where those partners or names of participants show up on the right-hand side as being responsible for that goal, and where the timeline is for that work to be done by that partner. And even though it feels like a pain to do all this before you put a grant in, it's so helpful if you're lucky enough to get the grant, because then you have a nice paper trail saying, going back to the team members saying, so we're in that quarter, where's everybody on their progress on that step of the project? Next slide. So in summary, do a lot of this work before you start writing a grant. Do a lot of the footwork of making sure you're the right person or you have the right partners, and that you're in you're looking at a grant program that you have a good chance of being funded on. We already talked about this, so let's get to some of the other slides, but make sure that you're building a good case for your projects. Next slide. So, and think like the reviewer. Think like what me and Becca get to be all the time. Hit the highlight. They're not going to live in your community. They're not going to have been a part of these discussions. So you have to highlight in the narrative why you're important, why Colorado is a special situation, or your community has a special situation, and really bring to life those priorities and objectives. Make that scope of work very easy to track. They're probably sitting down with 10 to 15 grants the day they review yours. So the easier you make it for them to track what you're doing, that you have the right plan of work, that you have the right budget to do it, that the more likely they can give you positive marks, because you made it super easy for them to evaluate that. And again, that project summary both should be your first step, so you can start recruiting the partners you need, and it should be the last step you go and refine after you have the rest of the grant written to tell your story succinctly, clearly, right up front so that grant reviewer gets excited about the next 15 pages they get to read. Next slide. And these are just silly things, but my ethics of grant writing are treat the team you're working with respect. And that includes, if you're asking people for letters, don't give them just 24 hours to do that. Don't, if you think they're very busy, write or draft something for them so they can refine instead of starting from scratch. Be very professional. And if you're lucky enough to be funded, shoot from the mountaintops who funded you, give them lots of acknowledgement and attribution, because they get a lot of people complaining to them when they don't get funded. They don't get nearly as many people being very thankful to them. So remember the ethics of this too, that these are hard things to do, but they're trying to get money out the door to make you guys expand your impacts. Next slide. And remember, gratitude, everybody who helps you, be thankful. Sit down and write a bunch of thank yous after you write these, because they're a lot of work to put together, and a lot of people leave the process really jaded, and we don't want you to feel that way. Next slide. So just as we wrap up today, we do now have a grants link on our website at Colorado Food Systems where we've accumulated all of these materials, and I'll put that there in a second. Next slide. And as part of that, we decided to make some office hours available to you all. So if you go to that website, and I'll put the link here in again quickly, you can, we don't know if we can do a one-on-one. We're going to see how many of you actually request them, but at bare minimum, we've set some hours that we know we can make available to you all, that if you want to sign up, we at least can do another one of these when you're a little further along and you might have really specific questions about how to put pieces of the puzzle together. And so we made this site for you, and I'll try to get that link in when I quit talking. But that's, we've already set some dates that we're willing to do those, but you have to sign up. So, and we'll share how to join us that day. Next slide. This is our broader food systems website, but what we would tell you is we have a newsletter we send out once a month. It's the only email you'll get from us, but we list all grants we know are currently competing in that newsletter every month. And so if what we talked about today and what's going to be competing this spring isn't of interest to you, go ahead and sign up for our newsletter, and you'll hear about every one the state or the feds put out throughout the year. Next slide. And the last thing we'd like you to do, and I just put the link in the chat box, whether it's right now or if you want to open this in your browser and do it later, we'd like to collect some information from you about what you are thinking of applying for, what you find overwhelming. If we do more webinars, what types of information would be more helpful. Plus, we're getting some opportunities to give the state and federal level some feedback on how they can refine their grant programs. So if you fill out that quick survey, we're compiling some of that to share above our level. So you don't have to feel quite so overwhelmed with the grant process. And then also you can see they started a Slack channel where you could post some questions about your grants that people who are far wiser than me and Becca can also answer. And then finally, a spreadsheet that they've developed here, the Colorado food system, where you can share some of your information if you want to collaborate and you've decided you can't do this yourself, but that you'd love to be in the circle of people considering putting in grants together. Next slide. And again, just to reiterate what you heard before, we have 2 more webinars coming up in the future that we'd love to have you join us for, and that will give slightly different context than what we talked about today. They'll probably talk a little bit slower, and that would be a welcome change. Next slide. Yeah, and we'll get more of these links in the chat, and my colleagues can do some of that while I'm talking, but we actually might be to the end of them. So it's only 5 minutes, but I know I can stay a few extra minutes more. Now open up for questions. Sorry, we covered so much so fast. Any questions? And you're welcome to unmute yourself.
Yes, and I do, while you're thinking of your question really quickly, I do really want to thank Don and Becca. This was amazing. So much wonderful information. You guys are just a powerhouse of knowledge in our state, and we're so lucky to have you guys. So please, everyone, do take advantage of signing up for those office hours. And just really quick on the collaboration stuff. So there's a Slack channel within the Colorado Farm and Food Systems Slack. So that will be a place where, like, if you need to message in the middle of the night, how did someone else deal with this? Feel free to share, ask questions, share. That'll kind of be a community of folks writing these grants. And then if you're interested in collaboration, you can fill out that Google form as well we'll get those in the chat. And that way you can, find other folks that might be in your region or across the state working on similar grant proposals or project ideas as a way to do that. So please connect, please let us know. Feel free to email me. You all have my email address. And anyone questions, I know Becca and Dawn have done a great job of answering questions in the chat, but if anyone has a quick question before we go, please speak up.
I will highlight that, I know there was a little bit of questions about it in the chat, but if you are considering applying for a grant, whoever the organization is that's going to take the lead should go right now and apply for a DUNS number. And somebody put the link to the DUNS number there. Essentially, this is registering with the federal government. The DUNS number can take a few weeks, and so you really need to do that. And you have to have a DUNS number before you can have a SAM. And the SAM is very quick. So anyway, that's why it's just a procedural thing. It won't take you long, but you should go and do that ASAP.
Yes. Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Oh, thank you. What do you know when the applications for the LAMP grants are going to open?
We were told last week when we scheduled this for this week, but we know they are on the administrator's desk because of a relationship we have in AMS. So that sometimes there's a political motive that they want to release it related to a specific event or something. But I think on this one, it's just a holdup. The good news is I think the holdup is they're literally might be caught, the cost shares might be gone, and the amount of money they have to spend might be going up. So what's holding it back is good news in that some things that have been challenging for people applying before might have gone away. But we cannot imagine it will be later than next week because they have to get it out by, I think, September 30th, which means they need to get on things. So that would be my best guess now. But I do know it's on the administrator's desk. So in theory, it shouldn't take long, but I said that 2 weeks ago. So I've been wrong before.
Great. Thank you, Dawn.
And the value-added producer grant is open, and that is part of LAMP. So it's the local food promotion program, farmers market promotion program, and regional food partnerships that we're waiting on.
Any other questions for Dawn and Becca?
Just again, if you apply for the office hours, we asked a couple of questions. The only reason we're asking that is if we have to kind of organize our thoughts because there's lots of you who need it. We just want to make sure we allocate the right amount of time and come prepared for you. So please fill that out. And yeah, the survey is helpful, not just for us to know if we aim these webinars right, but again, we are actually literally getting asked from the states and feds how to improve on programs. So you telling us what is the resource or psychological block or perception that's keeping you from feeling like you can apply for grants, or if you've applied and had trouble securing them, that's the place to tell us about what could improve. And that has worked in the past. So those phase ones that Becca talked about, the working stage or phase ones, those all got started about 7-8 years ago because people were overwhelmed with immediately going for operational grants. So that whole series of grant programs started because people said they needed a stepping stone into the larger grant programs. So they do listen. So if there's feedback you have, please do share it, and we'll do our best to share that with the people who have the power to make things better.
Dawn, is there a link for signing up for office hours?
It's on that CSU grant page. I'll put it one more time.
Thank you.
We made it a little more sophisticated than usual because it used to be whenever we gave one of these, we'd say, yeah, and anyone who sends us their grant will spend a half hour, an hour with it. When we heard that there were 200 people signed up, me and Becca realized that our heads would explode. So we decided to try to do it in a new way. And so this is the first time we've had people sign up, and it also makes sure we don't renege on our promise if we say we'll help more. If we still don't have we put them late enough, we think the RFAs will be out and you'd at least be able to get your project summary and objectives and goals put together. If that's not the case, we'll push them back and we'll add some ones further into May. But we made our best guess again about when they'd be the most useful for you to be kind of at least through phase one of your planning and able to get feedback, but still be able to change things if the feedback we gave you meant you did have to go find a new partner or something. So what we guessed, again, those are right. And so right now, those are for April 20th and April 26th.
And just remember, if there's any producers on this and you're applying for the value-added producer grant, it really is tricky about the budget. And so I know Anne's going to make these slides available, and we're going to as well through our food systems website. Really go and make sure you contact the rural development people, and we're happy to review it as well, just to make sure you don't get disqualified for putting ineligible expenses.
Yes, great. Also, just a quick reminder as folks are getting off that we have 2 more webinars coming up in this series. You'll get to hear from folks about their direct experience in our next one who have applied for different grants and been successful. And then that third one is going to be, you know, a discussion about maybe what isn't quite working, like Don said. So we'll be reviewing a lot of the information we get from you through the survey, and then also providing a listening session to think about both state and federal funding and what people need, what can better support our farm and food system in the state through those programs. So please join us for both of those. Also, we are recording this. We will send out the recording and the slides, all of the links, the worksheets. I think that's everything. So you will get all this information. We'll try to get that out to you as soon as we can.
And I can stay on for a little bit, at least if people have a couple questions before they jump off that are easy questions. But if they're bigger questions or you need to get started, please do use the office hours.
Hey, Dawn, it's Wendy. I just want to make sure you saw that note from Nathan that just came in that the survey might be broken. They got kicked off at the end. So maybe we should just double check that survey.
It did? Okay, thank you. I'll go check it right now.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate you being with us today. Hope this was helpful, and I'm sure we'll see you all soon.